in Chicago with her, I think, a band director's convention of some description. I talked with E.R. Hall today about two things. Diane had lost her mother a couple of weeks ago, and then about Brother Pack. You know, he's visited here during our meetings, and he's one of the elders at East Albertville, and he's not doing well. He's in Huntsville, in Nashville, receiving chemotherapy treatments. There's an arrangement where family can stay. There was a question whether or not to come back and forth to Birmingham, but Vanderbilt had a section where the family could stay throughout the week, and so that's what they've opted to do. But it's malignant, and they would certainly appreciate our prayers. He and his wife came during the time when E.R. preached for us once or twice, and then came again, believe during the time, maybe when Stephen preached our meeting about a year ago. Came back, I think, when Bill and Sewell were here. I don't think they were here when Neil was preaching, but anyway, they're great people, wonderful people. So let's see, I had that, as I mentioned to several of you. Lee is not doing well today. Counts for her absence. I was trying to think if there's anyone else that besides the usual ones. Okay. In our readings, we have come down to number 347, 48, and 49. That's 1st and 2nd Thessalonians and 1 Timothy. So we're going to go through these pretty quickly without going through the background of Acts. 1 Thessalonians has 5 chapters, and I believe 1 Thessalonians, if you tried to summarize it, it would be along the lines of living holy lives in view of the second coming of Christ. In chapter 1, their faith is commended in the light of the persecution they underwent. And really, in every chapter except the 5th chapter, you've got something said about the second coming of Christ in the last part of the chapter. You'll notice in chapter 1, verse 10, and to wait for his Son from heaven, whom he raised from the dead, who delivered us from the wrath to come. And then in chapter 2 of 1 Thessalonians, Paul talks about his own conduct among them, and then their conversion. They accepted the word not as the word of men, but as it is in truth the word of God. And then in chapter 3, he goes back to the historical aspect of what was going on. Paul, you might remember, Paul and Silas, Timothy had gone to Thessalonica in Acts 17. 3 Sabbath days they reasoned in the synagogue, and then there was an onslaught against them. And Paul had to leave Thessalonica and go to Berea, about whom Luke recorded the Bereans were more what? Noble than those in Thessalonica, and yet in Thessalonica they're commended. And then from Berea he went on to Athens, and that's the last part of 17. And then in 18 he goes to Corinth. And so what happens is at Corinth he sends Timothy is with him, he sends Timothy to Thessalonica to check on them. And you'll notice in chapter 3, verse 1, wherefore when we could no longer forbear, we thought it good to be left behind at Athens alone, and sent Timothy, our brother and God's minister, to the gospel, in the gospel to establish you. So he wanted to know how they were. And so he sent Timothy to them. Then Timothy returns, and he has a good report. He has a good report about how they're doing. And Paul was just, you read that first paragraph in chapter 3 of 1 Thessalonians, Paul, it's almost like he's wringing his hands beside himself. He just really is so concerned about, how the Thessalonians are doing. So he sends Timothy. Timothy comes back, but by the time he comes back, Paul is actually at Corinth in Acts 18. And so he gives a good report, and so then Paul sends Timothy back with the 1 Thessalonian letter. While they are at Corinth. Well, the 3rd chapter deals with that. The good report that Timothy had brought, and then a prayer for them. And then the fourth chapter, fourth and fifth, deal primarily with manner of life. In chapter 4, holiness is the key. Look at verse 3. For this is the will of God, even your what? Sanctification, that and you're set apart, specifically what he's talking about, that you abstain from what? Fornication. And the next few verses deal with that, the respect for other people's wives and so on. God called us not to uncleanness, verse 7, but in sanctification. So you got moral uprightness in 1 through 8. 9 through 12, you have social uprightness, love the brethren. In verse 11, study to be quiet, do your own business, don't be busybodies, walk becomingly toward them that are without, do your own work. And that will come back in the second letter. Then the end, verses 13 through 18, deal with what would happen to Christians who had what? Had died, right. And then in 5, it continues this idea of the day of the Lord, that the one thing you can know perfectly is that you can't know anything as to when he's going to come. And then the last part of the letter deals with various exhortations. All right, well then we turn a page, at least in my Bible, to the second Thessalonian letter. And it seems evident that it was written not long after the first one, probably from Corinth, same place. Silas and Timothy are mentioned again, same people in the salutation. And I believe that you could look at here's what must have happened. Paul says, I want you to live holy lives, sanctified lives, and in light of the fact that Jesus is going to return. Well, during the time they got the letter, and just a little later, there was some misunderstanding as to maybe the significance of the Lord's coming and how soon it was going to be, if it were going to be immediate. And so evidently some of them had thought it is going to be immediate, and so let's just stop our working and so on. So 2 Thessalonians is written primarily with two parts to it, and that is there's going to be some things that happen. The Lord is going to make things right that are wrong at present at the second coming. Those who have been afflicting you will be afflicted. And you can have rest with us at the revelation of Jesus from heaven with the angels of his power and so on. And so, yet, when that's going to happen, it's not immediate. So in chapter 2, he says there's going to have to be a what first? A falling away, that's right. An apostasy is going to have to happen first. And it's going to come, this apostasy will come, and it will be characterized by deceit, by lying wonders, verse 9, and it will cause people to believe a lie and be what? Damned, who believe not the truth but have pleasure in unrighteousness. But then he comes back in 13 through 15 and says, but I'm thankful that you're not among those, that you actually believe the truth and you're living sanctified lives. And so then he has a brief prayer for them in 16 and 17. And then in chapter 3, he deals with the idea that in the first few verses of praying for them, but primarily verse 6, we command you, brethren, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that you do what? Withdraw from those who walk disorderly. And then he identifies specifically who some of these people are. They are not working. They are busybodies. And he deals with some of the same things that he had dealt with in 1 Thessalonians 4. And so it seems like the two main ideas are there was some misunderstanding about the immediacy of the return of the Lord. He's not going to come immediate. There's going to be a falling away. And it looks like they had somehow stopped their work, and he says, you need to get busy and do your own work, do your own business. Yes, sir. Oh, it's just stretching. Okay. All right, so that's 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Then we have one other with 1 Timothy. Whenever you can find a verse that says, this is the reason I'm writing to you, you can always take that to the bank. And I think 3:14 and 15 provide a key as to why Paul is writing Timothy. Timothy was in Ephesus. Paul had already gotten out of house arrest in Acts 28. He had done some traveling. But he says here, these things I write to you, hoping to come to you shortly. But if I tarry, that you may know how men ought to do what? That's right. Our behavior in the church in various relationships. So in chapter 1, he deals with, and there's another term that you can kind of see little benchmarks, so to speak. The word charge, command is behind the word charge, admonish, command, encourage you to do this. The word charge is used in the American Standard, the King James, quite a bit in 1st, 2nd Timothy. Verse 3 of chapter 1, as I exhorted thee to tarry at Ephesus when I was going into Macedonia, that you might charge certain men not to teach a different doctrine, neither give heed to fables and endless genealogies. But the end, verse 5, the end of the charge is love out of a pure heart and good conscience and faith unfeigned. So in chapter 1, he charges concerning doctrine and past charges, what Christ had charged him, that is Paul, and then he charges Timothy to war the good warfare back in 18 through 20. In chapters 2 and 3, it looks like he deals more with public worship and prayer, especially 1 through 8 of chapter 2. He mentions about prayers for kings. And then verse 8 kind of ties it all together. I desire, therefore, in light of all this, that men, and that's not mankind there, that's the males, men pray in every place, lifting up holy hands without wrath and disputing. And then 9 through 15 deals with whom? Women. In a similar way that I dealt with men in public life and so on, in a similar way I'm going to instruct the women to live a modest life, should I say a retiring life in godliness, quietness, and so on. And verse 15 is a kind of a key here. She shall be saved through her what? Childbearing. I don't take that to mean that she'll be lost if she can't have a child. But childbearing is basically put that she is more interested in what? Home, family. And if they continue in faith, love, sanctification, and sobriety. Then chapter 3 deals with what? Elders, qualifications of elders, deacons, and I believe even the wives of elders and deacons are dealt with in verse 11. Women in like manner must be grave. And then in chapter 4, I take it that he deals with the charge to preachers. Timothy was one. And in verses 1 through 5, with false teachers, their description, they're hypocrites, they speak lies, they command things that are not so. And then in 6 through 16, what makes a good preacher, a good minister? He uses that phrase, if you put the brethren in mind of these things, thou shalt be a good minister of Christ Jesus, nourished in the words of the faith. And then in chapter 5, in 1 and 2, older men, older women, younger men, younger women, and the respect for them. And then in 3 through 16, two different kinds of women. Widows indeed, or who are truly indeed, they have no family, and widows who do have family, and what to do toward them. And then 17 through the end, I take it he's dealing with who? Elders and prospective elders, laying hands at his appointing of others. In 6, 1 and 2, what relationship is dealt with? Servants, masters, and then in verses 3 through 10, the idea is an exhortation to godliness with contentment. Godliness with contentment is great what? It's great gain. And then in 11 through 16, it's interesting, you could follow but thou, O man, flee these things, follow after righteousness, godliness, faith, fight the good. You could keep the alliteration of the elfs going, and it would be flee, follow, and fight in those. But keep those things, and then remember the good confession that you made, verse 12, 13, 14. And then in 17 through 19, his charge to what group of people? To the rich. and then to Timothy himself to guard that which was committed to him in verse 20. So a lot in these passages that are really it's a wonderful. I tell you, just the reading of one book is kind of like what we were doing here. You read 1 Thessalonians one day, 2 Thessalonians the second day, and then today 1 Timothy. It helps to read through without stopping. Just read through a whole letter when you can, these shorter ones. And so for Sunday, we have 2 Timothy, Titus, Philemon, and the first 10 chapters of Hebrews. All right, any comment or question? Anybody? All right. Okay, so we are finishing Esther, and my hope for us tonight is for us to finish Esther and then get right on into Ezra with a type of a little overview. Okay, let's see here. Here we go. Here's where we have been. You remember the chart. We have been studying from the beginning. We have the 586, the destruction of what city? Jerusalem. And then 536, Zerubbabel under the protection of what king? Cyrus is able to go back and lead a group of Jews back. And 536, 535, they're rebuilding the temple, but they get discouraged. And so what happens is Haggai and Zechariah come onto the scene, and they encourage them to finish, which they do in the year 516. Somebody said it? 516. Good. About 4 years later, they finish it. All right, so then we have the story that we just finished, the story of Esther. About 484, where we come onto the scene with Ahasuerus, and then about 478 when she marries him or becomes queen, and then about 474 BC when the people are delivered that we've just been studying about. Now, what's going to happen here is that we've already studied the first return under Zerubbabel, and that was earlier. We've already seen that 536. And then what we're coming up to, see, Ezra fits in here, and then about 20 years later, not quite 20 years, we have the events of Ezra 7 through 10. So, I've got several things on here. This is part of a little overview that I had earlier, but I've doctored it a little bit. In 538, Cyrus defeats the Babylonians, and unlike others, he allows the captives to return to their homelands, live by their former traditions, worship their respective gods, yet they remained a part of the Persian Empire and subject to the emperor. Jews were exiled to Babylon in 3 stages. We just noticed that on the other chart. And they returned in 3 stages. Zerubbabel, 538, 536, the temple begins. However, and then that's covered in Ezra 1 through 6. However, after approximately a year, the work stopped. Haggai and Zechariah encouraged them to resume it. They did and finished it in 516. Now, this is where I doctored it. After about 30 to 35 years, and the events covered in Esther occurred, which we come onto the scene, and Ahasuerus is reigning about that. He begins his reign, and then about 474 is the time that we have the events with Haman and the deliverance of the Jews. So about 30, 35 years later, deliverance from Haman's evil schemes occurs. Esther, the 10th chapter, which we'll get to in just a second, indicates Mordecai's fame and the goodwill that went throughout all the provinces. And so with Esther as queen, Mordecai as prime minister, second in command, they paved the way for the work Ezra and Nehemiah would do. So in a sense, like Joseph in Egypt, Daniel in Babylon, Mordecai and Esther were in Persia. And so the will of God was being carried out. They were, obviously, Israel had been spared. Not quite 20 years later, after the events in Esther, Ezra will lead the second group, 458 or 457, depends on who you read from Persia to Jerusalem, and instituted a number of spiritual reforms. And then about 13 years after that, Nehemiah leads the third group, and then they rebuild the wall around Jerusalem. A little bit after that, we have the last prophet, which is Malachi, right? Okay. We've looked at this. This is basically the major two divisions historically, excluding Esther. And this is the same chart that we've given you before. And this is where we are now in Ezra. We have been up here with Xerxes, or in the Hebrew, Ahasuerus, right? And now we're going to have the stepson of Esther, who is Artaxerxes the first, or Longomanus. Longomanus. Did anybody look up what that word meant? Kirsten, you know what manus means, probably in your biology study. What is it? Hand. Long hand. It's understood historically that Artaxerxes had his right hand was evidently deformed or something. It was much longer than his left hand. So Artaxerxes was known as Longomanus or Longomanus, long hand. Anyway, so the time that he is, his regime is about 464 to 423, and the time we've already established is about 458, 457 when Ezra's returning. All that is in your stuff that you've got going. So put it together in just a kind of a highlighted bullet type format. The first return, the temple work, Esther that we just studied about, and then we go down another 20 years to the second return, Ezra from Babylon to Jerusalem. We've already studied the first 6 chapters of Ezra, where he deals with the restoration of the temple, and primarily under Zerubbabel, the governor. Now we switch gears. He's writing in third person in 1 through 6, and in what in 7 through 10? First person, yes, and that will be under himself under this time. So Artaxerxes is now king. Queen Esther's stepson, that is who Artaxerxes is, and it's about 58 years after the temple was completed. That's 516. About 80 years after the Jews had first returned to Jerusalem. So you get those perspectives in your mind. You know, I relate to 80 years. I'm not that I'm 80 years old. I know that. But I relate to things that happened because the people in my life were alive. And I think, well, 40 years ago, 20 years ago, you kind of get a perspective of what time feels like when you say 5, 10 years, 20 years, 40 years. Ezra was a priest. He went to teach Judah the law and restore the temple. So here we are in chapter 7. Ezra comes to Jerusalem, and he's going to have a commission from Artaxerxes, and then his words of praise in chapter 7. Anybody have any quick comment or anything that you want to add before we go on? David, you look like you were ready to say something. Anybody?
Did we say Esther, the book of Esther was 5 years?
No, it's actually a little bit more than that, Patty. Turn over. It's easier for me to look at it. If you'll turn over real quickly to Esther 1. The events that happen, well, you can look on the chart at the exact dates. Xerxes was 486 to 465. But if you look in verse 3, in the third, this is 1:3, in the third year of his reign, he made a feast. So the events start probably around 484 BC. You see that? 484. All right, then if you go to chapter 2, verse 16, the 7th year of his reign, that puts it down to about 478. That's when Esther becomes wife. That's the 7th year. Then look at 3 verse 7. What year do we have there mentioned? The 12th year, and that would put it down to about 474. And really that's about the end of, that's chronologically the end of, that's the last year where everything else is happening. So I'd say that to answer your question, and it's a good question because I like to look at things like that, That makes it a good one because we both like it, don't we? But if you go from probably about 484 to 474, about a 10-year span, would include everything mentioned in Esther from this third year of his reign all the way down to the events, the turnaround, the turning of the tables of Haman. But primarily, about the 12th year of his reign. So does that kind of help on that? Okay, good. All right, let's go. Where are we? We're in Ezra. Okay, so, what I wanted to do, let's turn over to the Waldron material now. And they have some really good information here at the top of page 95. Let's read just a little bit of this, and then we'll go on, and we'll just go ahead and read through chapter 7, I think. Page 95 of the Waldron material. Are you there with me? Page 95. Okay, at the top, Ezra the priest, as we noted earlier, the temple was completed the 6th year of Darius, 516. All of us know that now. Then his son Xerxes ruled, and we had the story of his queen Esther. Remember, the Jews became well known and respected in the days of Esther and Mordecai after the death of Xerxes. His son Artaxerxes the first took over. He ruled from 465 to 425. Therefore, he was king during the days of the last three great characters of the Old Testament story, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Malachi. As you study this part of the book of Ezra, compare it with the first 6 chapters. In this part, Ezra uses the first person as he tells about his experiences because this is the group he was responsible for, and this is the work he was assigned to do. Most of the first chapters are copies of decrees, letters, and lists. The group under Ezra returned more than 75 years after the first group returned with Zerubbabel. It seems evident that no one from that first group actually recorded the details of what happened, although the important documents were carefully preserved. Ezra would take the documents, and inspiration of the Holy Spirit recorded the history for us. So, in the 7th year of Artaxerxes, about 458 to 457, Ezra comes over here to Jerusalem. Now, let's leave the Waldron's material, and let's go to our own Bibles, and let's begin our reading here in chapter 7. We did not actually finish Esther 10, the latter part of 9. Just remember, I'm sure you already read it, but chapter 9 ends up with they're turning the tables on the 12th month, 13th day, and they kill 500, 300, 75,000. And then, as a result of that, what feast comes out of that? Feast of Purim, right. And the rest of the chapter 9 deals with, Ahasuerus is saying you can write a letter to the Jews. Mordecai and Esther write this decree, and then there's a second letter that says, we have the stamp of approval. You go ahead and celebrate these days. And then chapter 10 only has 3 verses, and it shows how great who was. Mordecai, his greatness, the joy that was in the kingdom, the provinces. And so you have Esther on the throne, Mordecai is second in command. And it looks like, as I mentioned on the one of the charts, it looks like that their influence has kind of trickled down. And we have the work, that Ezra is doing roughly 20 years later. And it's kind of paving the way for some of this seemingly goodwill to be expressed even toward Ezra. All right, let's read some. Ezra 7, the first 10 verses. Patty, if you would, please. If you don't mind. Yes, ma'am. Okay, let me pause you just for a second. That indicates that Ezra was of what tribe? Levi, and he was a what? he was a priest. Okay, good. Thank you. Go ahead, Patty. All right, so that last verse, probably most of us have quoted before, memorized, heard lessons on. It is very descriptive of who Ezra was, and the mission of Ezra. He's described a little bit earlier in where does it say he was a ready scribe or a diligent scribe? Verse 6, he was a ready scribe in the law of Moses. What do any other translations have for ready scribe? Skilled. He was a skilled scribe. Kirsten, you and Kyle can tell the class what a scribe is. Sorry, go ahead. What was a scribe? Exactly. And if a prophet or someone would tell them what to write, then they just what? They copied it down. And so here is a ready, a diligent, a ready scribe, a skilled scribe. Well, you know, sometimes you can hear something taught, but if you hear it and you're jotting it down as you hear it, it's a tendency to make you do what? You remember it better. Yeah, always when you have more physical action involved in the learning process. That's one thing. I didn't way back I didn't have anything like PowerPoint, I'd jot a few things down on the blackboard, then the whiteboard, and my handwriting was poor, and I look back and I just, I feel for people who had to put up with me. Still feel for people, but had to put up with me. But this is so much clearer. And when you can see that, and then if you jot down on your Bible or on a notepad or something, it has a tendency to stick. And the reason I'm saying that is that here is Ezra. He's already a scribe by trade. He is of the family of Aaron, so he's a priestly, so he's thinking about the law. He's thinking about the sacrifices. He's thinking about the worship of God, and he's always writing it down. And it's interesting that in verse, we find out the time he comes back. In verse 8, came to Jerusalem in what month? The 5th month, which was in the 7th year. Let's see. It took him how long to get there? Let's see. He came to Jerusalem in the 5th month. That's verse 8. And that was the 7th year of the king. That was about 458 BC. And how long did it take him to make it? About 4 months, a little over 4 months. You know, we think of how long it takes to get from one place to another. If it takes over a couple, 3 hours, we think, man, it's a long trip, You're talking about months. And so he goes from Jerusalem, and to go from Jerusalem, I'm sorry, not from Jerusalem, from somewhere over in Persia, likely Shushan, in order to get from way over here, way over to Jerusalem, he had to go in a direct route, straight across, right? No, because they would go right, it would carry you right through what if you did? The Arabian desert. So they go basically what we call the Fertile Crescent. It's like a crescent. It goes over, up and over, and several hundred miles. And so he does that, and as he's going, verse 10 is so significant. I mentioned that, and I left it a minute ago. Ezra had set his heart to do 3 things. To what? Seek the law of the Lord, to do it, and to teach it. Is that not a wonderful lesson for us?
Is that not what the priests were supposed to do at the beginning?
Exactly. Good point, Brother Charles. That's exactly what the priests were to do. They were to study the law, know the law, so they could impart information about the law, impart the law itself. And so Ezra is doing exactly what had been intended by God from hundreds of years before. He set his heart to seek the law. I was thinking about this on the way over. You know, any worthwhile endeavor, you've got to plan, don't you? You've got to purpose, plan, resolve, dedicate yourself to something. He set his heart. It reminds us of Daniel 1, when Daniel had proposed in his heart not to eat of the king's dainties. Exactly. There's a settled mind. I was, things come up. I may have told you about this. When I was in school at Tech back in the 70s, I had some buddies down at Auburn, and it wasn't but about, hour and 50-minute drive from Atlanta to Auburn. And I'd go down there and spend the weekends sometimes during the off season. And Harvey Glantz, y'all know who Harvey Glantz, the Olympic sprinter, was. And some of the guys there who were members of the church had gotten Harvey to actually attend with them. Dave Bradford was preaching there at the time. And anyway, I heard several stories about Harvey. And I met him when I was down there one weekend. They had a little get-together with some of he's just a really, nice guy. But they would talk about how they would see Harvey out on the track, 6 o'clock in the morning, cold, rainy. It didn't matter what the weather conditions, he was out there doing the extra because he was preparing for the Olympics. And, you got to set your heart. I'm going to prepare myself. I'm dedicating. It doesn't matter if it's rain, thunder, lightning, what. I'm going to do this. And that just always stuck with me. When somebody is determined they're going to do something regardless, that you see it. And with Ezra, he had set his heart to seek the law, to know it. And then secondly, to do it himself. And then third, to teach in Israel statutes and ordinances. Teach everybody else what he had learned. Is that really any different from what the New Testament teaches Christians to do and be? It really isn't. All of us are to learn, to seek the law, to seek God's kingdom and his righteousness what? Matthew 6:33. But seek ye first God's kingdom and his righteousness. All these things shall be added. To seek the law, to know the law. 2 Timothy 2:15, study to show yourself approved unto God, a workman that needs not to be ashamed. He set his heart to seek the law, to know it. Well, we quoted Acts 17:11 a while ago. The Bereans were more noble than those in Thessalonica, and that they received the word with all readiness of mind. I think the New American Standard says eagerness of mind, searching whether those things were so. And so there's the eagerness, there's the determination to do that. All right, a second thing, to do it. It's one thing to set out to learn something, but then when it comes down and I find that I need to be doing something I'm not doing or not do something I am doing, we got to determine, set our heart, when we learn it, what? We're going to do it and fix it. And then the third thing is everybody else really needs to know what I've learned, right? I might not be the sharpest knife in the drawer, but if I know something more than somebody else and our eternal salvation hinges on it, I can share it with that person. I can share what little I know. And so to teach in Israel statutes and ordinances, that's what he did. Great, great lesson. So you get really the purpose of Ezra kind of in encapsulated form right here in these verses. So he's going back primarily with the mission in mind to teach, to reform the people, to teach the people the law of God. Well, he has help. In verses 11 through 26, that really takes us almost through the end of the chapter. I might interrupt you, David, but if you would start reading for us there, 11 and following.
This is a copy of the letter that King Artaxerxes gave Ezra the priest.
All right, if you had to summarize about 2 or 3 major ideas of this lengthy reading, Artaxerxes is giving what? Giving authority to Ezra, and giving money, goods. Okay, everything they need. In fact, you would say, and they gave even a little bit to what? A little to boot. Would you say that? And then there was an additional protection. They were not going to have to pay what? Any taxes. So here it seems evident that what had gone on during the time of Esther and Mordecai's influence, along with Esther, if it's true, that you can read outside, you don't read this in the Bible, but you can read outside in some places that Esther, outlived Xerxes and lived way on into the reign of the stepson, Artaxerxes, if it's true, and she exercised some influence over him, and so did Mordecai. It would make sense. I think, and I've got a slide on this we'll probably get to in just a second, but you could really see in some of this, it's almost like the idea of God's providence over his people in their deliverance is continuing in this part look at verse 6 again of the same chapter. Ezra went up from Babylon. He was a ready scribe in the law of Moses, which the Lord God of Israel had given. And the king granted him all his requests according to the hand of Jehovah his God upon him. God's hand on him. Well, that didn't mean necessarily miraculous, but things were going well for him, kind of like Joseph in Egypt. God was with him. And that seems to be in several instances here. Yeah.
There's a plan behind this. You got to do what your God said.
Yeah. Yeah.
He's got to realize, to me, the power of God.
Yes, I think so. I think so.
I can't remember exactly the first thing that you said. This may be, but verse 26, he also gives them the authority to execute judgment. Whoever didn't observe the law.
Yeah. Among their own people, whoever didn't, then they were able to basically execute their own law among themselves. Yeah. Later on, what the Romans would not allow. Yeah, good point. Good point. All right, well, let's finish up. Kylie, if you would, 27 through the end, 27, 28, and Ezra's words of praise are here at the end, okay? All right, and then chapter 8 describes their coming on to the city. All right, real good. Let's see, that's all I had. I had some other ideas that I've changed documents here. I'm just going to stop with that. Let's stop for time's sake, and Lord willing, we'll pick up in chapter 8 and keep going. 8, 9, and 10, and we'll end Ezra. And so we're making real progress, I think. So you kind of get it in mind. 1 through 6 happens early on. They return and they start on the temple and finish it. And then we have Esther. And then we come back Ezra 7 through 10 when Ezra himself returns, and we have what's going on there. Yeah.
It's just amazing they went from wanting to kill all the Jews.
Yes, to helping them out.
Now he's giving them money, gold,
Yeah.
whatever y'all need.
Yes, whatever you need, you have it. Very good, very good. Anybody else?